Welcome, welcome, welcome. It is God's Comic Brad Stein, and it is Brad Stein Has Issues where comedy, conservatism, and Christianity collide in a cacophony of clarity. I am Brad Stein, my sidekick, my son Wyatt Stein, and today's guest is a very unique guest because he's going to talk about God and Batman. Wait, what? That's right. He breaks down the story of the Batman and how it actually has Christian overtones and how we can look at that story and actually see God and his plan for the world in the story. He's actually Professor Jonathan Ashbach, and he is somebody that is a Christian, but he does what needs to be done. And I don't know if you know what that is, Wyatt, but did you know that in human history, stories are the ways that we have continued as humans. We've told stories, and some of those stories tell about the great victories of our warriorship. Some of those stories are about the great defeats. Sometimes the stories about floods that destroy everything except the moon. Let's say the moon was high enough that it couldn't be flooded. Sometimes the stories are about other civilizations, fantasy stories. But the point is simply this, Wyatt. Humans have existed and have passed on their stories to tell the world who their ancestors were, who we are, where we're going, how we're going to get there. And so, Wyatt, I think today's theme is stories. And if you think about that, let me ask you a question. Do you have any creepy stories or nice stories that makes us all feel happy and want to drink honey?
I have neither of those, but I do have my old catalog of Lowe's stories.
Oh, that's true. We can always reach back into the annals and bring back what it was to work for Lowe's, the degradation, the lack of dignity, the pain, the suffering. I mean, you used to tell me that some people would come to shop there just to point and laugh at the employees.
Yeah, we called them window shoppers because primarily they went into the doors and windows area. That's where a lot of the hijinks happened.
I never thought about that, but you know what? If you went shopping for a window, which you do, because every house, unless it's a cave, has a window, more than likely, you are literally window shopping. And if you had, because I don't know if you know this, window shopping used to be about in the olden days. If you were, let's say, in Manhattan, New York City, where it was just like building after building and retail space after retail space, they all had front windows that were just basically they could have all kinds of advertisements in that, or they'd have a dummy wearing a suit because it's a suit making guy, or maybe it's a hat guy and he's got some kind of hat thing. So people would literally window shop. They'd look in the windows and see what was out there to see if it was going to entice them to come in. So window shopping now has a new name in this techno age. It's called clickbait.
I hate that I have no answer to that.
Well, my point is this. The whole point about the window is to make something so compelling, interesting, intriguing, creative that you look in at and you go, I got to go in and I've got to buy one of those. I have to see what that looks like. And
why not just have a giant neon sign saying stuff here?
Because you don't know what the stuff is, and you may not be shopping for stuff. And that's what I'm getting at.
And what are you shopping for? Things?
Things. And if you get the right things and enough of them, you could say it's stuff. But you know, George Carlin did a whole routine about stuff. And I have to say it's my least favorite routine of his. I've never liked that one. I didn't think it was so funny. But he was a brilliant comedian. But my point was this. If you are a window salesman and you take some of the newest windows, the newfangled windows with some kind of new kind of crank system or automatic push the button to open system, or perhaps something implanted in your brain that you can just will the window to open, and you put it into the window display so that people can come and say, if I need a window, this is where I want to go. Then they were looking through the window to look at windows, and that would literally be window shopping, or windows driving you towards windows. So it's windows divided by themselves. So it would actually be not called window shopping windows, but windows squared?
Windows squared.
Yeah, because it's like divided by itself. The windows are driving.
That's not what squared means, though.
I thought you said it meant something it can only be divided.
No, that's a prime.
Prime.
Squared means multiplied by itself. You have just exponentially increased our window problem. We've been trying to fix it for years, and then you go around squaring everything.
Wait a minute. What if you were looking for a window and you had multiple windows to choose from? Then it would be a multiplying window desire for you to grab. Thus, the window shopping does in fact become window squared because...
I mean, that's one way to look at it. I thought the problem was we were looking for round windows, and you've brought us a square.
Well, listen, we got one right there.
I thought that was a porthole from when this house doubled as a submarine.
Well, yeah, no, that was just in case the God ever brings a flood again.
Yeah,
we'll
and we remember to bring the periscope and the air holes, right?
Yeah, well, I had those installed when we first built this entire studio because
Can't have a submarine without the air holes. How else would you breathe?
I understand. Well, listen, that's why the Navy looks to you when it comes to their new submarine technology. Because you're like
my dual-purpose screen door entryway was a big hit.
Wyatt, are you claustrophobic?
No, I like silent.
Okay, so do you find yourself uncomfortable in closed spaces?
Nope, I'm not closet phobic.
Okay. So the reason I ask you that is that I think everybody's a little claustrophobic. I mean, if anybody was stuck somebody in a casket and shut the door and you were like, everybody like, I'm not comfortable
Well,
here.
would it be the claustrophobia that scares you or the buried alive that scares you?
I think both have some remnants of fear inculcated in their existence.
Honestly, I think the only difference between claustrophobia and common sense is if I'm trapped in a really small compartment and there's no way out, I'm afraid. But claustrophobia is if I'm stuck in a really small compartment, I'm scared, even if there's an easy way out.
Yeah. Well, it's just you feel like you can't breathe, but you can.
But what? No.
But here's the point I was trying to make. I actually had somewhere I was going to take this, and you took a whole new direction. So it's almost like
I'm sorry, Mr. Square Windows Man.
Listen,
I didn't know you were on a roll.
I'm not on a roll because squares don't roll.
Actually, they tested it. Square tiles in a car kind of work.
Only if it's going over.
No, on flat land, because like each of the corners is a point of connection to the road. Yeah. They did it on Mythbusters.
I don't know.
So you know it's legit.
Yes, well, they are the quintessential proof that myths are in fact busted or not.
They are the quintessential proof that every problem can be solved with more explosions.
Oh, and no explosion can compete with a cement truck. Oh, that was a beauty. That was so Guy. Guys love things that blow up.
It didn't even sound like an explosion, which was the best part.
It was almost like, it was like this weird, almost like ricochet.
It's like even the sound was concerned.
Yeah, it was just like ricochet, like it didn't want to deal with it. But like the wind was screaming, "Don't do this!" But I want you to know that claustrophobia. I was thinking about this when you mentioned submarines. I cannot imagine a more horrifying detail than to be getting inside of a tube. We're going to crank it shut. You couldn't get out. We're going to take it, I don't know how deep, a mile under the ocean for like a few weeks. You'll never have an outside to look at. You're breathing some kind of reprocessed air. I don't know how they do that. And you're not going to feel the wind, and you're stuck inside of this thing, and you're in the ocean. You don't know if it's going to suddenly sink or implode, like that one poor guys went to that fun submarine getaway, and the thing just went, okay. But can you, I think you must have a very special mindset to be able to be a submariner.
I can imagine it like, Mommy, when I grow up, I want to know what it's like to be in a sardine can.
Well, that's what I'm getting at. It just feels like it would be frightening, but yet
Like,
some people have done it, and it does. They don't think twice about it.
I-
It's like the guys that go caving. Do you ever see that guy that
oh
fell into?
my goodness, I have seen the stories of caving. It's like John Smith decided to go into the instant death Ultron 9000 cave, where no one has ever returned, but he had a flashlight, so he thought he was safe.
Oh my God.
And then it's a 6-hour documentary of his slow, agonizing death.
The guy that got into the thing and went down and got.
It's just
I mean,
it is of every single job or hobby. Did you really have to pick the dangerous,
Yeah.
creepy one? Like, could you not have gone for knitting? Honestly,
and there's people that do cave diving, scuba diving, where you literally need ropes because it gets silty and you can't. I don't.
Like,
Don't.
let's see. What are two people's greatest fears? Bottom of the ocean, caves. What if we combine them to make the ultimate sport nobody wants?
I'm telling you. But I scuba dived, and I used to scuba dive until I had an incident that made me no longer liking scuba diving.
Yeah, that
It's a
tends to
story.
happen.
I told you that story, though,
Yeah,
one time,
yeah,
didn't
yeah,
I?
you told
About
me
the
that story.
time that I was trying to get narked, and it didn't go well. Anyways, that was a story, though, of my life. It was the only time that I can recall that I could have died, that it was like, danger. Okay, this is real. You could be dead. You could drown. So that was rough. But did I ever tell you the story of? Did I tell you this? I hope not. But maybe I did about the presence, the demonic presence that hovered over my bed once and dealt with my. Do you remember that story?
I think you said it on the podcast
I did.
a while ago.
Okay,
yeah.
okay. Good. Because that was a story I was going to say, and now I realize that I already said that story. So
That doesn't mean you can't say it again. Do you know how many times I've reused Lowe's stories over the years?
Yeah, you don't really.
I already had like 5 minutes worth of material. I just stretched it out for 2 years.
Okay. Well, I'll tell you what. Here's a story that you guys should hear. It's a story of a man who was concerned about what it meant to be a believer. Now, as you know, and I don't know if you think about this regularly, but I'm a Christian. That means I follow Jesus, and Jesus is way in front of me. That's why they call him followers, by the way, Wyatt. He's way over there, and you have to just like try to keep up, and you're always winded, right? Because he's like the cat. Try to get close, he's way up. But I wanted to make this podcast also not only about sort of just a couple of you and me thinking about life and laughing and joking, but then, of course, poignant moments, and we've had those, and some funny moments, we've had those, some scary, silly moments, some moments where everything went sideways with the podcast production. We've had those numerous times. As a matter of fact, we're experts at that, but we're actually getting, like, better. No, well, I don't even know what the answer is. We're getting incompetent when it comes to being incompetent because we're not doing it anymore. We're actually nailing this thing, Wyatt. What happened?
I don't know. I honestly don't. I push for the buttons. And
Arbitrarily?
well, of course. How else do you want a podcast?
Blindfolded?
Blindfolded, one hand tied behind my back.
Right, feet?
Yeah. I don't. And in fact, the roadcast wasn't even plugged in.
Yes. And yet the podcast we're killing
I
it?
don't get it. I didn't go to college for 6 years to not learn how to do this so it could fail.
All right. Well, listen. Here's what I'm not going to judge you, son. You've come so far in a guy that really just got thrown into. You were probably taking a nap, and I said, "Can you come up here real quick?" And
Yeah,
what is it, Dad? I want to do a podcast. I need you to run the board. Okay. I don't even know
I
what.
just closed my eyes one day, and then the next day I woke up like, oh, why am I in the studio now?
Right, and I'm the what? The sidekick. Can I just start with the button first? But it's about judging. I wanted to talk about the idea of judging. Now, one of the things that is misunderstood when it comes to the Christian is that they will say, you guys aren't supposed to judge. Now, I gave you an answer to this years ago before we went to college. I don't know if you remember what it was, but I gave you some tools to be able to interact with people depending on how they were going to interact with you. Do you remember what I said? If somebody says, you tell them something or say something or make an observation about the behavior and they say, who are you to judge me? What you're supposed to say? You're not supposed to judge people. What do you say?
I
I told you this answer. It's a real zinger.
to be a single.
Well, try it to me. I say something to you, and I want you to say, you're not supposed to
but you
judge
gotta say
people.
something first. Yeah.
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 So, anyways, I don't think that you should be taking so many naps. You should be working harder at building this podcast.
How dare you? Who are you to judge me?
Oh, you mean like you're doing to me now?
No.
Yeah. In other words, if somebody ever says, "Don't judge me," the only comeback is, you mean like you're doing to me now? Don't judge me always presumes that their perspective, their objective, or well, actually subjective opinion is allowed to integrate into the conversation, but you aren't allowed to judge or hold them to a particular standard. Now, here's the thing. They misunderstand, and this is the one thing I did tell you for sure, as I said, if somebody talks to you when you're in college, because you were going off to college, I said, and they bring something up, I said, one thing you always have to do is you have to what?
Define your terms.
Define your terms. So if they said, well, God is love, you say, yeah, God is love. What is love? Can you please define that so we make sure we're speaking of not just the same word, but the same definition? So judging is defined by progressives as thinking you're better than them, deciding that you get to control them. That's what you'll always see on the internet. Religion was just created to control people. Well, first off, if I choose to listen to the mandates of the religion, it's not controlling me. I chose to allow its perspective to be true, to be my foundation for morals, for my behavioral choices. So it's not controlling me. Now, if you want to say that some cult leader creates worlds where those who join his cult, he can tell them what to do and control them. Yeah, that happens. That certainly happens. It also happens in totalitarian dictatorships like Mao Zedong did, or Pol Pot did in Cambodia, or Stalin, right? All the atheist foundational communist ideas do deal with a demand that the leader control you. But it's ironic because that's communist, and communism was Nietzsche, and Nietzsche said that the religion was the what is it, God, I just blanked on it, the morphine of the masses, or do you know what I'm talking about? Oh, okay, here's why I made a mistake. I knew I got off. I said Nietzsche, I meant to say Marx. Karl Marx.
Ah, yes, that common issue.
Well,
that
Nietzsche
arises.
was the atheist that said God is dead, but Karl Marx, the opiate of the masses is religion. And yet, communism's entire belief system is to control the masses. And who controls? The self-appointed elite. So judging, there's a difference between arrogance, self-righteousness, I'm better than you, or I give myself a power and I enslave you. That's different. Christ doesn't honor that, doesn't allow that. But to assess people and to make objective observations based on God's word. Now, you don't have to believe it's God's word, and that's a whole different thing. Then you say, yeah, ignoring that. But to assess and to make decisions like you shouldn't go 100 miles an hour, you're judging them, but it's based on what is the law, what is supposed to be done for the good of all. So that is a whole different thing. And so that being said, I did do a original Brad Stein Has Issues rant about judging. I thought to myself, I don't think these guys have seen that, so I'm going to put it out onto the marketplace and let it be revisited. So watch this, enjoy this, see if it gives you some insight, and if you don't like it, don't judge it. Wyatt? Hey, it's God's Comic Brad Stein, and a quick warning, if you happen to be female, black, transgender, hunchback, lesbian, vegan, social justice warrior, Antifa, Muslim, albino, atheist, anti-gun, global warming expert, animal rights activist, deconstructed Christian, or progressive, you might want to change the channel. This is gonna get rough. I am a missionary to America. I've been called by God to help educate, inform, and inspire those of you who are tired of being ridiculed, slandered, and marginalized for your beliefs, and teach you how to fight back with faith, freedom, and philosophy. I realize Philosophy isn't spelled with an F, but I just needed the sound to make it flow, as well as making me sound TED Talkish in my skills. But back to me. I must admit, I never anticipated that I'd become a prophet to America using my comedy and satire against political correctness that started many years ago. But for those of you new to my comedy, I was one of the first comics, and still the only Christian comic, to warn America and the church about the evil political correctness, and do it using laughter and fused with some Christian worldview. That's why so many churches bring me in for outreach events, because, well, we laugh and then examine truth. Recently, there have been others that have made an international impact by standing up against the nonsense of PC. One guy I love is Jordan Peterson. Watch.
Why should your right to freedom of speech trump a trans person's right not to be offended?
Because in order to be able to think, you have to risk being offensive. I mean, look at the conversation we're having right now. You know, like, you're certainly willing to risk offending me in the pursuit of truth. Why should you have the right to do that? It's been rather uncomfortable.
And then presidential candidate Donald Trump began using the technique. Check it out.
I'm not going to give you a question. You are fake news. Go ahead.
Pretty interesting and profound, huh? Well, now notice what I said years before both of them.
For crying out loud, but this whole idea of oppressing them, it's people hurting our feelings, is arbitrary. People just don't even have to have an argument anymore. They just say, you've hurt my feelings. You know how you stop political correctness? You stop doing it. Somebody says you hurt my feelings, and you say, I don't care. Game over. I win.
So, periodically on my show, I'll be giving you weapons to defend yourself and your freedom. So let's get to it, shall we? Lesson 1. Here's a phrase I hear younger folks use all the time, like a weapon. Don't judge me! By which I reply, you mean exactly like you're doing to me now. Never ceases to amaze me how incredibly easy it is to manipulate your average American when it comes to controlling their freedom. You'd think nothing would be more sacred and important to an American than their free will and the freedom to exercise it in public and private, whenever they choose. Sadly, this isn't the case. We've got a group of Americans that have learned that they can steal other Americans' freedoms anytime they choose, simply by demanding they be treated in a way that they never reciprocate. For example, if someone says, you can't judge me, there are many of you who take a pause and feel uncomfortable because you begin to battle within yourself, wondering, am I judging them? Who am I to judge? But here's the flaw in the reasoning. Whenever someone tries to control your behavior, they normally do it by invoking a moral claim. They're implying it's immoral for you to judge them. Ask yourself, where do they get their morals from? Whenever someone makes a moral claim, they got to justify it. This is the irony of the phrase, you can't judge me, because the moment someone uses that phrase, they are literally judging you and your behavior, which is exactly what they've just forbidden you to do to them. So rule number 1, if someone demands a specific behavior from you, but exclude themselves from having to behave the same way, they are, by their own definition, immoral, and they are stealing from you. See, the only moral code humans are actually bound to is the Judeo-Christian God, as that is the standard used by the West for thousands of years. One of God's commands is, judge not, lest you be judged. But what measure you meet, if it's going to be measured to you. But in context, we're not to be hypocrites by judging others by a separate standard than what we judge ourselves. We judge things all the time, and we have to. When someone says don't judge, they're assuming there's a standard by which we're all bound. So judging or assessing a behavior, it's necessary, as long as it affirms what God says about a behavior. The Bible says drunkenness is a sin. If someone is drunk and you say it's wrong, you're agreeing with God. He made the judgment. We're just passing on the info. So you practice lesson 1 by getting used to always seeing if people ask something of you that they're not willing to do themselves. If so, they can safely be ignored and judged. I even mock them, but I'm a comic. Till you do this, You're going to be run roughshod over by those who judge themselves superior to you. You like this new freedom? Stay tuned, my people. I'm just getting warmed up. So that's what happened once in a situation with Jordan Peterson and a woman, and it really was the thing that launched Peterson into the stratosphere, the idea of people deciding that you don't get to judge people, and yet they're always the judges. I also wondered if any of you guys saw my little escapade with Laura Trump. Now, she's moved on now. She's got a big show, I guess, on Fox. But I wanted to show you this clip because I thought you might find it interesting. And again, remember, All Bratson has issues. I'm trying to show you guys things that, not for you guys that are fans that show up. You've seen all the stuff and you're probably sick of it. But all the new guys, I want them to see what else I'm up to and what else I'm out about. And so I just thought I'd show this quick clip of me with Laura Trump. Go ahead, Wyatt.
You're famous, though, for being a Christian comedian. I would say before that was really a thing. Dinesh D'Souza even called you the most dangerous Christian comedian in the country. Why do you think you received that accolade?
Well, you know what? It's interesting. When I first started doing stuff within the Christian arena and churches and so forth, people would say he's a Christian comedian. And I would always make a point to say, no, I'm a comedian that happens to be a Christian, because I felt like just be great at your craft and let that be enough to represent who you are. But I realized the press, I had an 8-page profile written about me in 2004 in the New Yorker magazine. They called me God's Comic. I know. That's where I got the moniker God's Comic. That's what they called me on the online version. So they were like thinking, there's no way you can be conservative. There's no way you can be a Christian. And there's no way you can be funny. By the way, this is 2004. So we're talking about, like whatever,
it's frightening. It's 21 years ago, which is very upsetting.
And I am famous for being a Christian, but not just being a Christian. There's lots of them. As a matter of fact, it's the most popular religion in the world. But that I use that as comedy, which isn't the only guy in the world that does that. But then this conservative philosophical idea, not Republican, not political, philosophy, how we conserve things, conserve history, conserve life, conserve the original intent of the Constitution, trying to hang on to things that work and those that don't, we discard. So those are the things that made my comedy kind of unique, kind of one of a kind. And so I think that to see myself trying to figure out who I am and where I'm going, I got to tell you guys, it's been a challenge. I'm looking at this podcast, for example, and I thought to myself, and I've told Wyatt this, I said, I hope that we're getting somewhere. I hope that we're helping people. It's gone through so many iterations. When this started, it was just me talking literally off the cuff during Corona about things that were bothering me, and people liked it and they paid attention. But then again, they had nothing else to do. So it was easy to kind of grab an audience because people were sitting around waiting for something to happen. Then we got the little space in my home, and we built it out little by little that you guys helped me do. Not only physically, but you donated to help it happen, so we could make it look better, so that I could be in coolness or heat, whatever was necessary, so I could do this year round. And we got that. And then little by little, I've added things to try to make it look nice and make it look interesting. And yet, the whole time, I look at this whole podcast, and I think to myself, what is it exactly God has asked of me? Because I've said this from the stage many times. I'm in ministry now. What that means is that I'm not doing comedy and then throwing a bone to God. To me, that's ministering to people. Ministering, like, hey, we're a great band. We make this much money. If you bring us in and pay us, we'll do this music. People will be moved. We'll throw in some God stuff. So we'll be ministering to people. But if you don't have the money, we can't come in, because it's really our job is to be this band, and then we will be ministering to people as added elements of the band. That's one thing, ministering. To me, ministry is if somebody says, we want you here and we need you here, if you can, if it's possible, I'm not saying it always is, but if it's possible, you go, even if the money isn't what you're used to, even if your time is going to be difficult to do. There's times that you simply do it. I've had opportunities where people didn't have much money, and I would say to them, I can't really literally afford to go for that. But what I'll try to do is this. How about when I'm back into this area of town, I'll let you know ahead of time, and then I can come in and give you your reduced rate to help your ministry. I just have to make it practical. So help me find jobs, or I'll find my own that pay my fee, and that way I can afford to give you something. So that to me is what ministry really is. It's the body taking care of each other. The churches or the organizations that are more fluid and have more finances, they pay me a fee and I come in and I perform, but then it allows me to help other people. And so the whole podcast to me was simply I guess a way to be seen, a way for people to hear what I have to say, a way for people to get to know my heart, a way for people to understand what it is that I'm trying to, what I feel like I'm called to do. And that is to tell God's story with comedy. That's the flavor. That's the interesting package it comes in. But also with this heart of discipleship, that the whole point of to be a Christian is simply this, to give your life away and let God mold it into something that is specifically used just for him, representing Christ and really replicating Christ's life the best you can in your flawed way to the masses so they can see that there is hope, there is God, he has been here, and he's given us a way out. So I got to tell you guys that Wyatt and I, we talk about this, we pray about it, we wonder to ourselves, are we doing something right? Are we building an audience? Because I try to look at it like this, you guys. If it's not bearing fruit, and I've said this from day one, then I don't know why I would do it. If it's not helping people, if it's not stimulating people, if it's not encouraging people, then I don't know what I'm doing this for. Seriously, why spend the time, the money? So it has to have some value. And yet, there have been people that have worked as missionaries in some far-flung village somewhere that nobody knows they're there, and there's, 32 people in the tribe, and they are trying to bring God's love and his hope to them, and maybe eventually somebody gets saved in the crowd, or maybe they don't, or maybe it's just a tiny little group and it never gets anywhere, and the guy just kind of dies in obscurity. And I guess he could think to himself, well, maybe I didn't bear fruit. Maybe there was no value there. But you know what I found out? What I found out is this. What you have to do if you're a true believer is you go where God sends you. You go tell the story. That's what drives you. And then if there's money that can go with that to help cover your cost, if there is some fruit that is coming from that, if there is a larger audience, if there is some kind of conclusion to this thing that is the most return for its money, and God expects that, by the way. There is the talents, the parable of the talents. A guy was given 5, 3, and 1, and the guy with 5 gave the guy 5 more. He didn't say, you're greedy, you're greedy. He said, well done, and the guy only had 3. So a guy didn't say, be jealous of the guy with 5. He said, all I gave you 3, but be the best with that 3. And he went out and he doubled it, and he gave him back 6. He said, well done. One guy had 1 thing. He didn't say, don't be greedy about what these guys have. Don't be coveting what they have. I've given you 1. That's all. It's okay. Go make the best with 1. What'd you bring me? He said, nothing. I buried it. I didn't do anything with the 1. What he's saying is, if you do nothing with whatever little talent you have, I consider it wicked and evil. The guy with 5 that got 5 more with the big giant church or whatever the ministry is, you're thinking, well, of course, it's easy for him. He has this money or whatever. He planted seed, bore a crop, and gave it back to God. It had nothing to do with the numbers. It had to do with the heart. I did the best I could with what you gave me. And there is no room to covet other people's riches. It's irrelevant what the billionaires do. It's relevant what you do with what you have. It's relevant how you think about people that have more than you. And they might be evil, and they might be abusing money, and they might be exploiting people. That's true, and it's evil. And they'll get theirs in eternity. But what your job is to do the best you can with the 1 you have. Well, that's what I got. I got this 1 thing, and I want to see if God can help it grow, get more creative. You know, one thing in the Bible God had promised you'd get if you asked for? Wisdom. He said, ask from God for wisdom, and he will give it abundantly. So I come to him now, and I recommend you do this in your life. When you come to a place that you're not sure what the next move is, should I buy this? Should I not buy that? Should I sell my business? Should I jump into this job? Should I take this thing? Should I move to this place? Should I marry this person? You're allowed to say, I don't know what to do. I'm not going to just sit there and wonder that magically I'll understand somehow in my heart. Give me wisdom about this decision, Lord. You said you'd give it to me liberally. I expect that wisdom that will tell me exactly what to do. I know it's from you. I know it's blessed from you. And I know that it will bear fruit. So I'm asking God for wisdom. I want this podcast to get even more creative, even more interesting, but most importantly, it bears fruit, that people see it and they're moved. It draws them to Christianity, draws them to Jesus Christ, the only person ever proven to be God in human history, the most famous human in human history, and the most famous book in human history. I want people to know that. I want people to be inspired. I want to help people overcome challenges in their life that they're not sure about. I want to help people have hope. I want to help people overcome addictions. I want to help people find answers that they don't know where to look. I want to be that guy. And so I just kind of always come to this podcast. I'm in my room with my son, kind of alone, looking at a camera in a microphone. I don't see you guys watching. I don't know the hundreds and hundreds of people. And when you look at the views that come afterwards, it's always afterwards. We get a handful tonight, as you can see, but we always get hundreds later, sometimes more hundreds, sometimes thousands, sometimes just hundreds. So who's watching it and where it's going and how it ends up and how it bears fruit, I'll never know, because I just kind of feel like I'm talking to myself right now. But I know that God's using it. He's putting it out there. And so that, to me, is the key. And part of that is also having guests that I think will be interesting to you. Very eclectic. I love the idea of bringing in guests that aren't typically what you would find on a Christian podcast. And they're not always believers. Many times they are. But again, all truth is God's. So if somebody has something to tell you about the truth that God has given to the world, and they can illuminate that, and we can just apply that to our faith, or can drive you closer to faith, then that truth was God sanctified it and used it, even if it came from a jackass or an atheist or a Muslim or a transgender. It doesn't matter to me where it comes from. If it's true, God is in the middle of it. And so I found this guy online. I saw him being interviewed, or maybe I read an article, but I found it interesting because he's a Christian and teaches in a Christian university, but he has this entire sort of thesis about Batman and the movies of Batman, and really dissecting it, because I talked about stories and how this kind of shows who's God in this, where's Jesus in this, where's the evil in this, where's the temptation, what was it supposed to look like, Gotham, where did it go wrong, how do we fix it, who's supposed to come in, what does this guy represent? It's what stories are, because all stories are just re-representatives of the original story of God Almighty, the creator of all things, who put this universe and this earth into play, and then watched it unfold, watched it go sideways, fixed it in a way unlike any other religion in ever history. He literally dimensionalized himself, became one of us, died for us. It's the craziest story there ever was. Came back to life, and guess what? He really did it. Jesus really was crucified. It's proof, historical. He really was here. He really did miracles. People really saw him come back from the dead. You don't have to believe it, but it's documented as historical. It is not mythology. There's not a true historian in the world that doesn't know Jesus was real and was crucified at least. Whether he came back from the dead, that's what Easter celebrates. So I thought you guys would find this guy fascinating. And all I'm asking you, if you are a believer, pray for Wyatt and I to just get even more creative, more interesting for 2025. Have this thing grow into something even more fascinating, its own unique fingerprint, so it stands alone, and that God uses it in a way that honors him, and all the work that Wyatt and I put into it bears fruit, and eventually can even have a monetary return, so that I can afford for Wyatt to get paid what he deserves. Maybe I'll get paid someday out of it and help me in my ministry and allow me to be able to even to go out continually and work in some scenarios where they just don't have any money to pay me, but it's subsidized through other means. That's what it means to trust God. So folks, enjoy this very interesting, especially if you're a big fan of superheroes. But if not, you still might find this interesting about how a man, as a believer, looks at the story of Batman and how that applies to our faith. So, please enjoy and welcome with me on Bradstein Has Issues, Jonathan Ashbach. Folks, you know what? It's not easy being in the performing arts. It's not easy doing acting. It's not easy doing stand-up comedy. It's not easy being a musician. It's probably not easy being a yodeler, I'm sure. I wouldn't know. I don't yodel, but my guess is it's hard. But nevertheless, the arts have been around for a long, long time, as long as humans have been around. There's been this means of communicating that is, well, frankly, probably started out in a sacred hut. So we're going to discuss today with a very interesting gentleman. I just met him, but I stumbled across either an interview or an article about a book that he wrote called Winning the Crowd, Politics of Popular Films. And I saw that this is the type of stuff that interests me, and that is, how do we communicate and, I don't know, just try to tell the stories of the culture. And do they have an ulterior motive? Is there something nefarious going on? Or is it just the same old, and it's up to you to decide what it means? But we're going to find that out with a man whose book not only is interesting and something you should know about and buy, we're going to have a link on it so you guys can get it, but also just the whole idea as a Christ follower as to being the most able to discern what's happening in culture and be able to utilize it properly. So please welcome the man who wrote Win the Crowd, Politics of Popular Films, Jonathan Ashbach. How do you do, sir?
Good to be here, Brad. Thank you very much for having me. Can't tell you how delighted I am that people are paying attention to what I think is one of the more significant and underrated cultural forces of our day.
Yeah, well, I think you're probably right, or at least, you know what, I think there's something interesting in the idea of how we perceive motion pictures and film, because the truth is, over the years, I mean, I'm older than you, so I grew up in a time when when they told me that if you took certain rock and roll records and you played them backwards, there were demonic,
Demonic messages coming through.
messages in there that were backwards. It's called backward masking. And that somehow, even though you could barely understand the lyrics going front ways, somehow your subconscious mind was picking up some backward words that were actually a satanic ritual designed to infiltrate your soul. I mean, so, you know, that's stuff like that can be frivolously tossed aside as silly or conspiracy theory A, B, and C. So I think there is kind of this risk potentially of maybe seeing into the communication ideas, maybe things that aren't always there, but maybe there's also the same risk of ignoring what maybe is in fact an agenda to a certain degree. So let's start quickly with just give a quick background as to who you are and where you teach and why this book was interesting to you, so that at least when we go diving in full bore, people will understand the concept that we're trying to illuminate here just for a few minutes.
Oh, sure, absolutely. So I'm Dr. Jonathan Ashbach. I teach at Oklahoma Baptist University. Did a PhD at Hillsdale College and then taught at Baylor briefly before coming here. Why was this topic interesting to me? At some level, it's because I've always had an interest in literature, in story, and specifically in what that literature and story does, the way that it shapes us. So this began for me as a fairly academic pursuit, interpreting Shakespearean plays. I have an article on King Richard II and kind of what Shakespeare was trying to do in terms of his political thought there. But I've also always been interested in film, just loved film from a young age. And so film having the greater, I think, cultural resonance, unfortunately, perhaps, than Shakespeare. When I had the opportunity, I was a longtime fan of the Dark Knight trilogy. Presented a conference paper on that because I didn't have anything else that I was doing at the time. And I was like, I can finally indulge this sort of interest in in its political theory. And then Lexington Books noticed that article and asked me to expand it. So I got in contact with some friends and said, hey, we've got an opportunity to write something that's a little broader than this. Would you like to pick one of your favorite films, recent, blockbuster-ish, and talk about what's going on there? What's it teaching its audience?
So you were basically just sort of beginning this process of breaking down what films might mean, or if there is a subtext to them. And you started with a film you happen to like. So the good news is you really are a fan of film. That means that it intrigues you, it interests you, you have a passion for it. I wonder if you can help me understand, I guess, if what we're really talking about, and we're going to get specific. I want you to bring up certain films that everybody would be familiar with, and having you break it down just so that we can understand what you're looking at, and maybe teach them how to have crystallized vision when it comes to when you're being taught something. Is there something else going on, or is there a subtext? Is there some agenda-driven idea here? But here's the thing that I really am curious about. So I'm a professional comedian, but I'm a professional actor as well. So I've been in a lot of movies and I love them. I love acting. Before this, though, I was a professional magician. So I'm a sleight of hand expert as well. And I have been involved in different types of performing arts. I only bring that up to say that the arts interest me in a broad perspective, in a very Renaissance man way. I've been in a lot of performing arts professionally. Yeah. And so I want to start with kind of just the meta narrative. I'm curious about the big story, because the truth of the matter is the human history that we know started with oral storytelling. People were talking about the history of the tribe. Who are we? Where did we come from? How did we get here? How do things exist? Why is there crops? Why are there not crops? What's going on? I read a book years ago from the UK called The Death and Resurrection Show. It's kind of hard to get. But it was an interesting book because what it was trying to break down was, where do we come up with the performing arts? Why is there comedians? Why is there musicians? Why is there actors? We just take it for granted. You go to the theater, you watch a show, you're entertained, the end. But where did it come from? I mean, why are people suddenly, tilling a field and then decide, you know what we should do? We should all get together and dress up like some character from 200 years ago and pretend like we're telling a story visually to people. And his premise was this, that in the ancient times, there were places where the people would go, oftentimes the men, but sometimes both, would go to the sacred hut, and there would be a fire burning perhaps, and maybe they had taken some hallucinogenic mushrooms or something because they're trying to enhance their spiritual experience. But what they were trying to do is they wanted to tell the story of the tribe, and there would be a very specific guy that would tell that story. He would be the witch doctor, the shaman, and he would be given special sacred powers, and he would talk about the stories. He might sing a song. He help people remember the story. He might do a trick, a magic trick, where it looked like something appeared or disappeared, or maybe he would act out a story of a hunt. But ultimately, those sacred places began to become more entertainment. They still told stories. It still had hopefully a message, a moral, but it was basically not quite thought of in this holy context as perhaps it did. Now, I don't know if that is a true analysis of how we ended up with what has eventually become filmmaking or theater, but it certainly made sense to me because that certainly was part of the way that we told stories. So ultimately, what we are talking about today is storytelling. Is that God, who you and I both believe in, so it gives us a context here, had a story to tell. And that story is the ultimate meta-narrative of a continual subtelling of stories in smaller formats, but basically retelling the first story. that there
hmm
was a creation, there was a beginning, there was a good guy, there was a bad guy. In the end, the bad guy loses, but there's going to be a hard journey through the dark places along the way. All the storytelling that hasn't changed was the original story. So it's kind of a deep launch into the where we're going, because I do want to break down specific movies, but I want you to tell me your thoughts on that, on the meta narrative of what is story in general, and is there sort of an ultimate immutable story that has launched all the rest?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the children's book author N.D. Wilson, but in one of his books, the opening line is something along the lines of that there is only one story, and he goes on to explain that this is really just kind of a sub story within that. But I think it is very true that um, the Christian story of salvation history really is kind of the archetypical story. You have the story about the highest prince who leaves his throne in order to go save a princess, the church, if you will, from it, and he does it by fighting a dragon. And the purpose of that, right, is to express God's creativity. God, Athanasius, Saint Athanasius, in the incarnation of the Word of God, talks about how God created this wonderful, beautiful creation, bringing it into being out of nothing, out of his own overflow of goodness and beauty. And then sin enters the world through human disobedience, Satan's disobedience, and begins to tear away at that. And because of, again, of God's character, he wouldn't allow creation to be destroyed. He reflected his goodness and he wanted to maintain that. And so at some level, yes, I think that's deep in the human psyche just as such, that we recognize that there is a need for heroes to rise and battle evil, and the story of how they do that, I think, is at some level reflected in many, perhaps most stories. One other thing I just throw in here is I remind my students that at the heart of the Christian worldview, at the heart of the way that Christians look at the universe, is the recognition that it's not fundamentally just about stuff being there and things happening. It's also not fundamentally about one person knowing things. And in the Christian, tradition, the most basic reality in all of existence is three people relating to one another, forming a community. And when you introduce time into that and change into that basic concept, communities have stories. Their life together is a story. So I think at multiple levels, yes, that's correct. This is a deep part of who we are.
Well, and I also wonder too, because let's take the Genesis story, the origin story. So that's
Yeah.
written by Moses. We all sort of, I think, agree that he wrote that, I guess. I'm not a theologian, so maybe they've changed their mind on that. I don't know. I don't know. I can't keep up. But let's say that he wrote Genesis. So that's, I don't know, 6,000, 4,000, 6,000 years ago when he wrote that story. So he's referencing, of course, the original story, the launching of the first story, the meta narrative. But meanwhile, there's other tribes, there's other civilizations, there's other communities throughout whatever the known world was at that time, who have similar stories, but also different stories, their own stories that have kind of a whole different, or at least different gods, different substructures to it, even though you can find a little similarity altogether. So one thing that I think I want to, and the reason I'm kind of backtracking and going to the beginning of all this is because I think it will apply to where we're going to go in the modern times, because ultimately I believe that all truth is God's truth. So consequently, if there is an ultimate story and somebody else has moved over and don't have a direct contact to God or his revelation, they have to have a story somewhere. It has to come from somewhere. And it makes me wonder, does God give us innately sort of this sense of how this all came into being, even though it might be a different name, or like the Native Americans had the the great white spirit, or because they don't know Jesus, they don't know the name Jesus. But what if he's Jesus? That's just, they don't know how else to put it, but there's this guy that did all this stuff. And I'm not trying to get all universalism on it. I don't mean like that, but certainly I don't believe that God would leave people hanging, that his story has to somehow infiltrate into their world too.
Mhm.
And ultimately, that's why we all can relate to a story, even if I'm from Czechoslovakia or I'm in the Antarctic, Inuit. I can still watch a story and kind of relate because it's about humans.
Right.
So, do you think that there is kind of God crossed over into other cultures, even those that rejected him, and still was able to get his story foundationally established so that people could at least have a shot to find him down the road?
I mean, I think maybe this will answer your question, but I think the way that I typically think of what I take you to be talking about is that God creates us not just as sort of these amorphous beings, right, but as beings that have a nature. And that I think we'll probably talk about this a little bit more later on. But one of the things that means is that we have imprinted within us the image of God, and therefore some understanding of what healthy human relationship looks like. And from that sort of the creative human impulse and the understanding of what humans in relationship with one another looks like, comes naturally just this tendency, I think, to tell stories that capture our visions of what living together well looks like. Also, on specifically kind of with relation to the divine, it is fascinating just how deeply similar many different cultures' origin stories are. So I'm here in Oklahoma. One of the local Native American tribes, the Citizen Potawatomi tribe, has a museum / cultural appreciation center. It was one of the first places that I visited when I first arrived here. And I walk in and there's an exhibit that has passages from the traditional creation story of the tribe, and I'm reading them and I'm thinking this sounds like it's straight out of Genesis. So on the one hand, yes, I do think that's fascinating just how much similarity there is there. On the other hand, one of the other fascinating sides of that is just how much difference there sometimes is.
Yeah.
Something that I think biblical. So this is we're getting outside of my field here, but I have a degree in Christian apologetics as well, and so I've dealt with this a little bit in the past. But one of the things that I think biblical scholars have sometimes talked about is the some of the differences between Genesis 1 through 3 on the one hand, and then the other ancient Near Eastern cultures' creation stories. So, for example, the Enuma Elish describes the gods creating humanity as their slaves, whereas in Genesis, obviously, humanity is created to walk with God, for companionship with God, and so at some level there is similarity, but at some level there's also oftentimes, I think, major difference in the way that the story sets us up to conceive of our place in the universe.
So we have this ultimate story. Do you? I mean, again, I guess I'm just trying to kind of take the nuances of it because you're a professor in this, and so instead of just taking the easy way, I am trying to break it down and let people be a little bit deeper educated in this. That's why I'm not just giving you softball questions. I'm
Absolutely
thinking about some deeper,
totally fair,
curious effects about this because I think that people, I want to inspire them. So you would say then that I guess it's impossible to disconnect your Christian worldview from the way you perceive the story because we believe it, the God we believe in is real and gave us access to the revelation of how this all came into being. But do you think that there's, how would you define, is the story semi-simplistic? Is there fairly a simple formula? If we were just to bare bones, what is the story? You said there's only one. What is the story? And can you tell it without Christianizing it? And obviously I'm a Christian, so it's not like I'm trying to avoid that. But I just want people to see it on a very organic level. What is the story from which all stories derive?
Oh, sure. And I don't think I can tell it without Christianizing.
Okay,
Because in the sense that I think there is kind of an archetypical story, what I mean by that is, as a Christian, I take the major story of the universe to be the prince who leaves his throne to fight the dragon to save the princess.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you would say then that Genesis, I mean, is it Genesis? Is that where we pretty much get our story? Or is it a combination of other books of the Bible that in conjunction kind of give us the beginning? Why are we here? What went wrong? How do we fix it? how does it end? I mean, is it kind of that, would that be kind of a basic worldview definition of what the story ultimately is? Or is that just the story that we're all seeking the answer to?
Oh, sure. So I mean, I think at a general level, I'd say the Christian tradition, just as a whole, would be where I take that story from. On the other hand, yes, Genesis is going to be crucial. Revelation is going to be crucial. The rest of Scripture as well is going to be tied into that.
Okay, so you as a Christian then, were also very interested in film and I don't know, storytelling, maybe you wrote too, or perhaps you got into graphic novel. I don't know. I mean, I don't know everything about it, but if you're into the Dark Knight, I'm guessing you probably read the comics too or whatever. But
I actually did. This is one of those kind of funny things is I'm not much of a superhero person, and I'm really not much of a comic book person, but was introduced to the movies and recognized something deep going on in them even before I could articulate what it was. I did scribble stories. Somewhere I've got a fantasy trilogy gathering dust, but it's not been published or seen the light of day in any sense like that.
well, I just was curious because, like I said, I wanted just to get a little bit of a foundation of storytelling in general, the history, why it's important, why it matters, because we've always done it. All cultures tell stories and try to record them and keep them archived so that people never forget where they came from. And there's cultures that are very much into the worship of their ancestors, even because they don't want to forget who they are and where they came from. So again, that's the deeper, more philosophical breakdown, I guess. So let's make it a little bit more simple and get back to your ballywick where you put this book together, Winning the Crowd: Politics of Popular Films. So you started looking at films. You were a big fan. You're a Christian though, so you can't not see it without the lens of Christianity and how you would hope that God would want you to, what he would want you to glean from these stories, right? He wants us to see him in these stories, or if he's being misrepresented, if he's being left out, right? So do you think that film is different medium in its impact as, let's say, live theater, or maybe even a music concert where people are doing an opera or something like that? Do you think that film does have a very specific role in the way that it affects our psyche?
My tendency here would be to say yes, so I'm want to make sure that I'm prefacing this by noting that we're also here not like, this is not my area of specialty hugely, the kind of the particular impact of film as a medium.
Okay.
At the same time, I do have reasons for thinking that is the case. You can read a book or hear a story kind of told orally, and you engage with that story, sometimes very deeply so. But at the same time, film engages multiple different media at the same time, if you will. It's capturing you visually at the same time that you're hearing the story play out. And the music then is also going on in the background. So powerful images, powerful music, and sometimes powerful writing put together, I think, probably does have a uniquely powerful impact on the human psyche.
So, like I said, maybe I hope I'm not leading you into the weeds a little bit. I guess I was just trying to unpack as many angles to this thing before we start breaking down films in general. But do you think that films, how would you say they've changed? I mean, if you look at the original, of course, with any technology, obviously that's going to change and it's going to be more sophisticated. But I know when I've watched maybe documentaries about early film and things along that line, it's so interesting, Jonathan, because it's very difficult to put yourself back into the shoes of people who are watching movies for the first time, for example, who had never seen anything like this, and how absolutely magical it was to them, that it was mind-boggling what they were watching. It was like just this mystery that was being purveyed in front of them, going, look what we have done, look what that has done. But what I really found interesting was editing, because in the beginning, they didn't they it was sort of a straight shot, like they were shooting. All they knew was theater. So they sort of set a camera at one, shot a master, and there was the scene. And suddenly they came up with this idea of, and I think it might have been The Great Train Robbery, the original famous film, that they would cut from one story to the next. So here was the guy on the train, and suddenly they clip over here to the woman that's being, tied down to the train track, and then they clip over here to a guy on a horseback ride. And they were first concerned, well, people are going to go crazy. They're not going to understand what's happening because they didn't think that you could isolate each scene and let it make sense. It's all fitting together. And I never thought about how we make these edits in our own head and we put all the pieces together, but it's not necessary. We're actually watching somebody inside of a cabin and then a guy over here, and it's all just being thrown at us back and forth. So I found that interesting, that just getting used to how to navigate this process of telling stories was something that was so novel that they weren't quite sure how to even do it. So with that,
and even really using film to tell a story was a bit of a leap from its original development. If you look at some of the earliest Edison films, for example, it's just like a guy jumping on a trampoline, and the point of it is not so much to tell a story. It's just, here's a novelty. You can see someone who isn't there.
Yeah, and then suddenly they were following a story that was thrilling. Music was involved. They had the guy, of course, there was silent film then, so they would have somebody playing piano, and they were keeping you interested in adding that dynamic to it. And so it was interesting that they realized that there has to be some sort of emotional tie to this that hits all your senses. So here comes music, here comes lights, here comes the quick cuts, here comes the drama. Okay, so here we come full circle. We're in 2025, and we're looking at movies now, and they definitely have changed. I mean, we now have a lot of the easy term is woke. So we have this very specific worldview, clearly, that is being projected into these stories. And so when you began to put your book together or whatever, you really pick particular movies for a particular reason. I'm guessing it wasn't because you liked them, maybe, but I think I'm guessing it was because you felt like they had a very specific tale to tell in your premise as to how movies are being used to manipulate, maybe, or at least to create a point of view that they want you to agree with or begin to agree with. So can you start talking about that? Let's get to your book and just what you were breaking down. If you want to go to a specific film, feel free.
Sure.
But to start,
so for the most part, the decision about what films to include was made by the various contributors who contributed different chapters. I'm responsible for the introduction and my own chapter, and then other people had the opportunity to choose the ones they did. Now they did that within a couple parameters, and like I mentioned earlier, we're looking at mostly blockbusterish films, with the idea being not that they all had to be like top money makers, but mainstream films. And the point there is, art house films can be interesting, sure, but at the same time, I'm interested in the way this is impacting American culture. Individuals within it. And so I want to look at films that people, on the one hand, have seen, and on the other hand, can enjoy. Sometimes the art house films are a bit painful. So I was looking for films that are good fun, that have entertained people, probably rewatched, and that have been seen. I also wanted to look at fairly recent films again, so that we're not just kind of saying, at some point in the past this existed, but rather what are some of the films that both are expressing and also are shaping today's American society. Those are sort of the key parameters. With the other, with one more, I suppose, being, is this a film that has something significant to say about politics? In theory, in principle, you can take any film and say, what is this telling me about what it means to live a good life, what it means to achieve success, questions along those lines. But some films do have more to say than others. Some are you're kind of fairly standard. Let's have some goofy fun and some CGI. Others actually are seriously, seems like fairly intentionally engaging with a key idea, and then telling a story about it. I'm not sure if you want to follow some trail there, or if I should
Well,
give
I
you an
think so.
example?
I mean, so just to clarify, so you
Yeah.
actually asked people to
Yes.
suggest movies that you were going to kind of analyze, or
Oh, no, good clarification. I'm sorry. So I edit the book, which means I write the introduction and I write one of the chapters. But there are a variety of 9 other authors who contributed chapters that they wrote their analysis of those chapters.
okay, but they all chose their own film. We weren't
Correct.
taking one film and everybody was breaking it down from their perspective.
Correct.
Okay,
Yeah.
so and you did the editing. So did you
Mhm.
choose? I'm guessing there was a lot of submissions, but you chose the ones you felt were the most significant, the ones that you felt were probably most popular, so more people could follow along. What was your criteria?
Actually, it was far more informal than that. Basically, I just connected with a number of friends that I knew were also interested in politics and film. They brought up some films that really all of the suggestions were good ones, and then connected with some friends from friends that they recommended. That was our group.
Okay, so I guess I didn't realize that it also was political centric, that was a
Mhm.
theme that you really wanted to make sure was being analyzed. Now, was that having
Yes.
to do with just the latest the latest issues within the United States as far as politics, about the conflict now of Americans and the way they see the political realm, and how it's
Ah.
such I don't know, a divisiveness and whatnot.
Mhm.
So did you feel like you were trying to see if films had some play in that, had some role to play in that, or was that just more you felt the political films would be easier to dissect the story and show what was
Mhm.
trying to be told?
Sure. So at some level, it's simply I guess a function of the fact that I teach politics, and so that's the field that I'm naturally most interested in. At some level too, though, I think it's because politics engages with key ideas about power and about the good life that impact all of us. And so that was what I wanted to specifically focus in on. So everyone who contributed to the book is a politics PhD,
Oh,
with some focus on interpreting great texts.
okay.
Uh,
Well,
yeah.
then, now, are you able to comment on the other guys too, just so that in case we want to bring up some films, or should we kind of stick with your chapter, since that's the one you obviously are an expert on?
Oh, sure. I mean, obviously, I know my own chapter and my own film best. I can chat a little bit about some of the others. I've developed a fair amount of familiarity with all of them
Okay. Well,
at this point, and we really had a very good set of.
let's start with yours then. So what was the film you chose?
Mhm.
It was, tell me.
Oh yeah, so I mentioned earlier that I was interested in the Dark Knight trilogy from a young age, and it's the whole trilogy is my chapter.
Okay, so, but did you watch the film and break it down from those specific films, or just the story in general?
Good. So yeah, I do break it down by film,
Okay.
and sort of say, yeah, here's Batman Begins. What are the central questions? What's it telling you about those? Dark Knight Rises.
What was it about the Dark Knight trilogy that intrigued you? Can you kind of
Mhm.
look into yourself and introspect and say,
Oh
what
yeah.
about that? Because it touched
Mhm.
something in you. I mean, there's
Mhm.
Superman and there's Hulk and there's
Mhm.
lots of super guys, but
Yeah.
Batman does seem to be very mysterious. He seems to be a little bit more
Mhm.
almost in some odd ways an anti-hero, I think, in some
Mhm.
ways,
Sure.
even though he's the good guy, but
Mhm.
there is a lot of darkness to him,
Mhm.
a lot of melancholy, a lot of almost, I don't even know what the word is, but he's definitely different than the typical superhero that's kind of cut and dried. I know
Yeah.
who Superman is. I know who Captain America. I
Mhm.
know what he represents. Dark Knight seems to be in the
He's a
shadow.
darker, harsher, grittier sort of hero. Yeah, that's totally fair.
Why is that? What made him
Mhm.
that guy?
Mhm.
Go ahead and tell
Uh,
me.
Yeah. So I think the thing that makes the Dark Knight trilogy so intriguing to me, and really it's specifically Chris Nolan's telling that I find so fascinating. I don't have a whole lot of familiarity with the Batman lore as we've established, or with other Batman films outside of that. Chris Nolan is a magnificent director. Everything that he does, there's stuff going on behind the scenes. He has an idea that he's toying with, or a primal kind of urge that he's trying to explore. And specifically in this trilogy, Nolan is fairly intentionally, fairly explicitly dealing with some of the deepest questions in the political realm. Politics is about power. It's about force, and about how you use that. And that comes through with somewhat astonishing clarity in Batman Begins. Everyone in Batman Begins has this obsession with fear, whether it be, evident in a character's name, like the Scarecrow, or whether it be Ra's al Ghul, who's trying to release this toxin that induces panic in people. And part of the question that should raise, right, is why? Why is everyone so obsessed with fear? Especially when you realize it's not just the bad guys. Because the obvious thing would be for that to be what sets the bad guys aside. So they want to terrorize people. But Batman himself is also really interested in fear. He said, in fact, he says, or Ra's al Ghul, when he's Batman's mentor, says something along the lines of, to conquer fear, you must become fear. And when Bruce Wayne returns to Gotham, he says, that's exactly what I want to do. Why bats? Time my enemies shared my dread. And so what I think Nolan's recognizing there is that fear is power. In fact, one of Falcone just directly says that. He tells Bruce Wayne at one point, I could blow your head off in the middle of this crowded bar and no one would do anything about it. That's power you can't buy. That's the power of fear. And so part of what Nolan's doing, I think, is giving us a somewhat more brutal than people generally want analysis of what governance really is. When you break it down, it's power, it's the ability to coerce, it's the ability to produce fear. And so if we're asking the question, what is the essence of governance? What is the, if you will, the material cause of the political endeavor? The movie basically says it's the ability to cause fear in people in order to motivate them to do things. Now that sounds terrible. And the film also wants to balance that with the recognition that it must be used for some purposes and not for others. So on the one hand, right, obviously you have the bad guys who are trying to self-aggrandize, to gain gain money, gain influence, things like that. But on the other hand, you have at the same time in Batman Begins this very studied sort of investigation of what is an acceptable motive to justify the use of violence.
The moral element has to.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. And my argument is you have three different theories that get presented over the course of the film. The first is young Bruce Wayne, who sees justice as just kind of this primal vengeance. He's aggrieved because his parents got killed. He wants to kill the murderer. And so he goes to do that, but somebody else beats him to it, which is the only reason that he doesn't become a murderer. And really, he gets very much told off by Rachel, by his girlfriend, who I'll come back to in a moment, because she has I think the clearest articulation of the film's ultimate message. But it's made clear that was not an acceptable thing to do. That was a wrong choice. His father would be ashamed of him. You move to Ra's al Ghul, who has in some ways a very similar understanding of what justice is all about. He also understands it to be vengeance. But interestingly, Ra's al Ghul's understanding of vengeance is a much more abstract, much more impersonal view. It's not that Gotham has somehow specially offended him personally, that he wants to destroy Gotham, but rather he thinks that's just the right thing to do. They have sinned; they must be destroyed. It's kind of a very blunt version of the principle of returning to people what's due them. And both of those, as the film goes on, are shown to be the wrong impulse. Young Bruce's impulse, because he gets slapped around, and appropriately so, by his girlfriend, and then recognizes, yeah, I did. Just says straight out at the end of the film, this was wrong. Ra's al Ghul is the bad guy. He is what you're fighting against through the entire movie. What the film ultimately comes to, and what Rachel tells Bruce when she's reprimanding him, is that vengeance is about making yourself feel good, but justice is about harmony. In other words, the goal of the coercion that Batman wields has to ultimately be the good of his city. It can't simply be that he's making himself feel better. It can't also, interestingly, be a sort of abstract notion of returning violence for violence or something along those lines. It can't simply be about even perfect, non-biased retribution. Instead, the film's going to say, and Bruce recognizes this and says this to her at the end of the film, you were right when you said that. The goal has to be a positive one. In other words, it has to be seeking the good of the city. And so in one film, in Batman Begins, this fun action film at that, you have a very deep, I think, meditation on what is governance, what's its material cause. Basically, it just is violence, but also what is its purpose? What is justice? That famous question in the great tradition of political philosophy. And the film answers basically it comes down to seeking the harmony of the community, seeking the good of the city.
Hmm. Okay, but see, I could see that as being
Mhm,
a reference point for a secular humanist
mhm,
would say that it's all about human flourishing. That's basically what
mhm,
they say. That's the motivating force to neo-Darwinism is to survive, and the most people that are in the most happy and content and not in pain, that's what goodness is. So it's not very transcendent. It's pretty much a basic, uh, almost a just a well a humanistic perspective because I don't see how they're justifying their greater good, I guess. Now I'm talking Christian to Christian now, so I'm
mhm.
trying to understand. For example, you said in the beginning it's all about power. Politics is
Mhm.
about power. So would you then
Sure.
say to me, as a Christian or Christians listening or watching this,
Mhm.
but isn't that the original fall? There was God, he created Lucifer, and Lucifer said, no, I'll be in power. I will take the
Mhm.
throne. I will be God. So, I mean, I'm trying to sort of sew together the Christian worldview within as a reference point to how you're breaking down this thing. So, would that make sense to you, or is there a better or a deeper way to define how Christians see power, how the Bible teaches
Mhm.
us about power, and then what they're doing in a 2 hour film?
Mhm.
Where is the Christian perspective in that?
Sure. And at some level, this might come down to what precisely I'm looking for in the films that I'm analyzing. Because obviously I'm a Christian. I'm looking at this to some extent through Christian lens. But what I'm also interested, right, is not so much just asking um, the question of bringing faith into conversation with that, but also understanding just in its own terms. And this is really what I'm going for in the whole project, understanding in the film's own terms what its moral understanding is and what its presuppositions about the nature of the universe are. So really my project itself, I guess, is just saying in Batman Begins and the rest of the trilogy, in its own terms, how is it looking at these questions? Part of it also, though, might come down to, I guess, the perception that common grace is a bigger deal than sometimes we make of it in the Christian community. And so, even when a film like Batman Begins is not setting out to explain things in Christian terms, I'd be very quick to say, at the same time, that doesn't mean that it has no insights. That doesn't mean that it has no perspective into truth that's valuable for us because we're all made in God's image. Even people who are not Christians, even people who might be actively hostile in some cases to Christianity, are still going to have a conscience and insight given by God uh, that can be valuable for us to learn from. Yeah.
Well, certainly, but then we also have the challenge of we're Westerners, and in the
Mhm,
West, where the Judeo-Christian ethic was the fabric of our
mhm.
moral and ethical framework,
Oh,
we
absolutely.
we can't think differently. So what
Mhm,
I'm curious about, is let's say you were in a Hindu culture, or you were in a Islamic culture, or you were in a Buddhist culture,
mhm,
or where karma was involved, or you were involved with um, just a brute eye for an eye or whatever.
mhm,
So Christianity seems to offer something else, something that finishes the story, that makes it make sense, that helps us feel safe in it. I don't think that
mhm.
all ideologies do. I mean, some are very malevolent. Some are very, the demiurge, that God is in fact not a good guy, but he
Right.
made us and he can screw with us and make
Yeah.
us slaves because he can do whatever he wants. And
Mhm,
the Christian God that we believe in,
mhm,
um, very much had moments of brutality because he
mhm,
was trying to describe the 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 not only the cause of what sin creates, but what's going to happen. What are you going to reap from this
mhm,
kind of seed sowing? And then
mhm,
it becomes so brutal that he says, just to let you know, you
mhm,
can't fix this.
mhm.
So I'm going to have to, not only did I create it and give you the opportunity to try to remain in relationship, but you ruined it and now you can't fix it. And the only one that can fix it is me. And I'm going to.
Mhm.
I'm going to become like you, so that so that I can acknowledge everything you've done. I'm then fit to take the sacrifice because I was a human, was perfect. Thus, the sacrifice is complete because it's just. But we can't get out of our Christian brain. We can't get out of our Christian worldview. I don't want to. But I'm saying I think that the secularists, I'm guessing Nolan, I don't know if he's a Christian or not, I don't know. But I don't know that he's trying to make an homage to Christianity.
Oh no, he's definitely not. I mean, and he's not very open about his religious beliefs, if any. He had some degree of religious education, but I don't know if he would call himself a Christian or not.
So do you think that, I guess what I was getting at, because I also want to kind of educate people listening and watching, especially believers.
Sure.
So would you agree then with my premise that you can't really escape the way we see what justice should be, that we can't get that,
Hmm,
we can't really have any other way to define it but through a Christian lens? Because
gotcha.
Christianity doesn't, like, Islam is pretty hardcore. You
Mhm.
screwed up and you failed to measure up, you lose.
Mhm.
The end. And Christianity offers grace and mercy and forgiveness. There's these other elements that we can't get anywhere else. And yet, without them, we're doomed. So, those pieces of what we now would reference in one simple term, redemption,
Mhm.
also has to be in these films for us to feel a resolve in our spirit. There has to be, the bad guy has to lose and the
Mhm.
good guy has to win. It's the only way that it's fair, that it's just, that now we've restored balance to the world, and we can't live out of that balance. It doesn't work for us. That's why we need that happy ending, or at least a hope that it's going to move on to the next phase. If it didn't end with the first guy, all right, but you're going to give us a sequel somewhere. This has
Uh,
to fix itself, or we're not satisfied. Would you agree with that?
I might agree with a qualified version of it, which is a film that is seeking to tell sort of a story that mirrors the grand story of the universe. Um, I think does in that sense need to have a happy ending. Now, it won't necessarily be fully happy. Some of my favorite films are the ones where all the characters die nobly, but at the same time, there's a goodness there to the end. At the same time, though, I think there is. I don't think this should be one's sole viewing or one's main viewing, but I think there is also a place for a kind of film that's meant specifically as a cautionary tale that ends badly, and the point of it ending badly is look out in some situation in contemporary life, we too could go this direction.
So do
Yeah.
you think that the first one, then the first film that you just kind of broke down, so what political ideology do you think it's warning us about? Is it talking about
Hmm.
totalitarianism? Is it talking about despotism? Is it talking about oligarchs? Is it talking about technocrats? Who are we being warned about?
Sure. And so I'll give two levels of an answer to that. At one level, I think Chris Nolan is he's deep enough into his art that he doesn't generally have like a contemporary issue that he's worried about. What he's really more doing are asking what are some of the basic sort of primal questions, primal instincts of human beings in the political realm. At the same time, something that comes through a number of his films, and I don't know if would call this a contemporary issue, but is a concern about the fragility of human society, and a concern about the fact that we sometimes take for granted safe, if you will, political communities, coherent, at least coherent-ish political communities that more or less manage to function together. And Nolan's very well of the brittleness of that, the fact that humans can be turned against one another and it can all descend into anarchy, which is actually what The Dark Knight's about, and The Dark Knight Rises in different ways. And so, at some level, I think what he's sort of has in his target to a degree, is the idea that one might pursue just abstract justice to such an extent that one doesn't care what the cost of pursuing it is. And if one is pursuing abstract justice to the point of eradicating everything, because humans are corrupt, right? We have original sin. No matter how far you cut into human society, you're always going to find things that are wrong. If your goal becomes a negative one of repaying and eradicating injustice, rather than a positive one of seeking the good or the flourishing in a what I hope is not just a secular human sense of a human society, then you're in for some serious trouble. Essentially, you're in for destroying the city, eradicating the city, rather than trying to better.
So the Christian idea of justice, though, would be what? I mean, how would you, because if that's kind of what he's shooting for, and we as believers believe that we are watching metaphors of that within the structure of filmmaking, you know, again, I want you to help people, Christians, dissect these themes, and especially those that are erroneous, that are in fact sound good, but miss the mark for what Christianity actually is representing. For example, if I was to say to you, just using, you know, soundbite, you know, ideas that people use to, instead of having to think deeply, you know, well, love is love. You know, let's just take that one out. Like, love is love. Like, well, it doesn't mean anything. It's a tautology. It's, you know, what the only way I can know what you mean by that is to is if you define your terms. What is love? What do you mean by love? Tell me what you mean, so that, because we can use the same word, but we don't connect, and we don't know why we're talking around each other. It's because we're defining it differently. So what do you think the Black Knight means by justice? Let's do it that way. What does the Black Knight mean by justice?
Good. So I want to be cautious here, because on the one hand, I agree that there are different conceptions of what justice is, different conceptions of what good is, different conceptions of what love is. And in terms of trying to hash out particular issues, one does need to very carefully define, this is what I mean by this, here's why I mean that, and so forth. At the same time, a film, especially a fairly deep film like Batman Begins, will oftentimes not have, like, it won't be trying to flesh out like a whole definition of its key idea. It will oftentimes have a fairly limited point that it's trying to drive home. And what I think really kind of the crux, if you will, of Batman Begins' argument about justice is the fact that it's positive, the fact that it's aimed at humans' good, rather than simply being abstract and negative. So I don't think that Nolan goes through, you know, a full kind of working out of, here's what you need for a society to be just, here's what you need to do as an individual to achieve justice, things like that. What I think he does rather is say, here is one particular question in the realm of justice. The fact that many people, historically and in our own day, seem perfectly willing to tear down, burn the system, whatever it may happen to be, just so long as they eradicate injustice. And I think what he's pointing out quite correctly is that you can't do that. You can't in politics. You never eradicate injustice. It's just not a possibility. Shy of the second coming of Christ. What you can do is use justice to promote the good of the city, and it's that sort of the necessity of that positive drive that I think he's getting at.
Okay, so okay. Well, I guess, you know, here's why I'm stumbling around here trying to.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because I think, to be honest, I'm a Christ follower, and so I'm jealous of my ideology. I'm jealous of the revelation God gave to my people, because I believe it's, you know, the Bible is the revelation of reality. I believe it actually is what is really the true story. It's real, and it matters. And to toy with that is not going to get you anywhere, because it can't be done. And everybody has spent, you know, all the storytelling trying to see, is there another way around? And it never ends well. You can run from Nineveh all you want, but you're going to end up on the beach in the whale vomit. That's how it works. God had created what he expected, and you can't buck the order of things. Okay, so I guess what I'm getting at, Jonathan, is that
Yeah.
stuff like this bothers me, that they make these assumptions that they're making these deep films that are trying to really unpack the depth of a human nature and finding the ultimate reality. And aren't we all sort of, going our own way in the dark, but there really is this good, but they don't want to put a flag in the sand and say, and this is what it means. Here's where it comes from. Here's who deserves the honor for this concept to even exist. They want to skirt around that and yet think they're being deep. And it just bothers me, I guess. And maybe that's just my own junk, but I'm a Christian, so I want you to acknowledge what you're trying to dramatize, but maybe not acknowledge. Let's go to the second movie. So after let's see what did he do in the second film? Perhaps that was deeper, or perhaps took a different tack that what he was trying to establish.
Sure. If I may, before we move on to that, I'll just a quick thought about what you just mentioned. I think this kind of comes back to what we were talking about earlier, right? About there being many stories within the greatest story. My wife and I are reading during devotions through Esther right now. One of the interesting things theologians have long noticed about that book is God's name doesn't appear anymore. And so I think perhaps that's an example, even in sacred scripture, of the idea that while all truth is subservient to that greatest truth, that greatest story, something can still be true, something can still be valuable, while not including the whole story, and even sometimes not explicitly acknowledging, by the way, this is where it fits in. So on the one hand, I think you're correct that all truth is God's truth, and stories have to fit into that to be true. On the other hand, I guess maybe I'm just more comfortable with films being, according to their own self-reference, just that part of the story rather than kind of placing themselves.
Well, and I'm not saying that you have to be some evangelist or whatever for every time you're telling a story. Just let the story be, and people will be affected by it or not. I guess it's wearisome to me the amount of times that atheists and agnostics, whatever, will use and leverage the great gift that God has given to us, with justice, with human rights, with defending the downtrodden, with the marginalized, all these beautiful Christian ideas. But they don't want to acknowledge God. And it just bugs me. I mean, maybe that's my own personal thing, but it's, and again, there'd be no reason in Batman to say, just before we go any further, he's kind of like Jesus, and obviously it doesn't make any sense. It's okay to let the story stand on its own. I understand that, because especially as a Christian, if I'm presupposing that the true Christian story is obvious in all of this, even if people don't understand that. So that's okay. I guess I just feel oftentimes slighted that they don't give God credit where credit's due. But nevertheless, so let's move on to the second film, and tell me, so is this just an addendum to what he was already creating there? Is there another angle of what he wants to try to discover here that we get to learn what's happening in the second
Each of the films has a distinct question that it's asking. So that whereas the first film is asking what is governance and to what end should it be aimed, The Dark Knight really is this extended meditation on when is it okay, or more precisely, who has the right to govern, and that's a question that comes up a number of times, actually very explicitly in the film. If you recall, in kind of the opening fight scene when Jonathan Crane, the doctor, Scarecrow, is selling some of his drugs. He's meeting some of his buyers, and a number of kind of fake Batmen, copycats, bust in and try and shoot up the arrangement and try and do the same thing as Batman's doing. They make a hash out of it. Batman shows up. He beats everyone up, including the copycats, trusses them all, and he tells the copycats, "Don't let me find you out here again." And one of them just asks him point blank, "What gives you the right? What makes you different than you and me? In other words, what is it that allows you to rule while I can't rule?" And similar questions crop up a number of times during the film. The interesting thing is I suppose Batman's response, and I'll take this in a couple different directions. Because ultimately, when he's asked that question, what Batman says is, "I'm not wearing hockey pants." And what I take that to mean in context of the film as a whole, and what is going on in the film just at that moment, is that Batman can do this well. He has the capacity to execute real justice and to do it well, whereas the person that he's speaking to has tried to rule, but has actually just made things worse rather than making them better. And so one of the directions that the film takes this that people have noticed, and there's been a little bit of commentary on in the literature, is that Nolan's really interested in democracy in The Dark Knight. One of the actually self-conscious critiques, even by Bruce Wayne himself, of his own actions is the fact that it's not democratic. Nobody appointed him. Whereas Harvey Dent, the White Knight of Gotham, is precisely an elected official. And the film makes a great kind of emphasis on that. It's interesting because so Rachel Dawes, Bruce Wayne's girlfriend, is working for the DA. And that's a fact that comes up a number of times in Batman Begins, but nothing is ever said about the DA being an elected official. And then all of a sudden in the Dark Knight, that's repeatedly what the emphasis is on. Harvey's campaigning, that's where you see him. Bruce is throwing a charity fundraiser for him. And he's explicitly referenced as an elected official. His date at one point, the Russian prima ballerina says explicitly, "Gotham needs heroes like you, elected officials, not some vigilante." And yet what's really interesting about the film is that Nolan's quite skeptical of democracy. Now, but by that, I don't mean that he thinks we should just go with a strongman and destroy democratic institutions. Not saying that. Those institutions, in fact, are what Bruce Wayne is fighting to protect. And yet, as a justifying principle, as the thing that gives someone the right to exert force, it seems to be that what's going on in The Dark Knight is those who can rule well should do so. It's really more kind of the nature of their actions that's self-justifying, the goodness of the actions that's self-justifying, rather than kind of authority itself being a concept at all, if you will. I'm not sure if I'm saying that clearly, but does that make some level of sense?
Kind of, but he is an outlier. If he's trying to defend democracy, he believes there is an ultimate good and a hierarchy that should be honored for a civil society, and we don't have anarchy. That's what he's shooting for. Does he see himself as a necessary force that's not part of the system? Thus, he has a more objective view of how to defend it, or is he just see himself as somehow doesn't fit in, but he still knows what the ultimate good should be, so he's just going to try to almost doesn't trust himself perhaps as to be put into that position, so he's going to do it on his own terms, and then he can fade back into the dark and get away, so he doesn't have to have some bureaucrat telling him how to do it. I mean, maybe I'm overreaching, but I'm just trying to understand ultimately.
Yeah.
How does one work outside of the system, justify it, probably not allow somebody else to do so? You just proved it. You beat up the guys but yet acts as though I am actually the vanguard for the system. How does he justify that?
Good. Yeah. I take it to be a sort of, if you will, Aristotelian point. So Aristotle in the Politics, right, says, there are various cases that people make for aristocracy on the one hand, for democracy on the other hand, for monarchy and so forth. But the conclusion he ultimately comes to is that the kind of institutions aren't the important question. They'll have various points of interest. There are various reasons to think that a democracy, for example, might work better than other forms of government. But the ultimate, like the question of moral justification for Aristotle is just, is this institution working well? If it works well, if it produces good results, then the institution is justified. And I take something like that to be Christopher Nolan's point here.
Like a motivism in a way that you just that which you like becomes your moral structure. I like that, so it must be the good. I mean,
Well, there'd be a danger there. There'd be a danger of equating what I like with the good. But the principled argument, at least, would be that what is objectively good, what institution produces objectively good results, is the best institution.
Well, and
And that,
but
yeah.
I didn't mean to interrupt you, but
Yeah.
I'm going back to the philosophy that I
Mhm.
think is inconsistent is, and again, as a Christian,
Yeah.
well, wait a minute, who's defining the objectively good and what is it? I mean, that's what
Sure.
I just wondered if you felt like the movies tackled that, if they tried to find an
Gotcha.
answer to those things.
Good. And no, I think that's outside the scope of what Christopher Nolan is asking in that
And
particular.
I don't even mean
uh,
Christian necessarily. I
Mhm.
just mean some sense of I understand what we're shooting for. What is the the American dream or what?
Sure.
I'm just saying you got to have a foundation to
Uh-huh.
land, or
Mhm.
it's kind of like every man to himself. So I just wondered, because that is your
Oh yeah.
expertise, is breaking these down. Did you
Yeah.
ever feel like he helped us understand
Mm.
where we were heading and where we were landing? That would be better
Uh-huh.
than anarchy.
Great question. Um, to some extent, when we get to the third film, it'll define a little bit more what he
Go ahead
kind
and
of
jump
sees
in. Go
as the
ahead and
good.
jump into that then. So
Um,
to the third film. So what is
Sure. I'll just quickly add in The Dark Knight itself, I think his answer is vague, but as close as he comes to answering sort of what is the thing that's better than anarchy, it's civilized order, if you will. And that's my term, not his. But one of the things I note in my chapter is the way that Nolan is constantly taking sort of the symbols of civilizational order, like fire trucks, like nurses and hospitals, like police cars, things like that. And the Joker tries to destroy each one of them. The Joker basically is anarchy, and quite explicitly so again in the film. It says, introduce a little anarchy. I'm an agent of chaos. And so really what The Dark Knight is about is the struggle between order and chaos, between civilization and anarchy,
Yeah.
with Batman coming down on the side of order and civilization. Left vague what exactly that means. And I think without going into a dissertation on it, you do have to leave that kind of vague. And so fairly for the film. Yeah, I think that's sort of the divide there.
Well, it's
Moving.
just that
Yeah.
and I'm going to let you go move into through
Yeah.
them. I guess just sort of a final
Mhm.
addendum is
Sure.
that, but isn't that obvious that we would prefer civility and some kind of getting along and some kind of formulas by which we all can kind of agree, as opposed to every man for himself and just go shoot and rape and kill. I mean, isn't that kind of obvious? Isn't that what we would want? So what is the big
Sure.
revelation here? That
Uh-huh.
we'd rather not get shot in the streets. Oh, wow, my life has
Sure.
been. So again, it
Uh-huh.
seems simplistic to me, I guess is what I'm getting.
I think I'd suggest I mean at some level, right, it is a basic point. It's meant to be a basic point. It's like here's one of the sort of grand basic structural questions of politics. Um, and how do we approach it? At some level, the way that Nolan approaches it is relatively unique. Most people who think about politics for at least the last 500 years have tried to come from the perspective of finding some channel for authority to specify who precisely has the right to rule and who doesn't. And Nolan's approach is entirely different. He just says, if it works well, it's good. At an institutional level, don't take that as a moral rule for life, obviously, but at an institutional level, he's going to say those who can rule well, those who actually succeed in ruling well, are justified simply by the fact that they do so. On the other hand, the question of civilization versus chaos, I think that also has some bearing because, and this ties into his sort of attack on pure abstract negative justice in Batman Begins. Those who get caught up in the pursuit of an ideal are often really willing to tear down basically anything that stands in its way. And you can see that, I think, on both the right and the left at their extremes today. Perhaps you mentioned kind of the threat of woke influence in Hollywood. One example of that would be people on the farther left who are willing to destroy any institution that they see as standing in the way of social justice. There are parallels on the right, perhaps a little less in your face, maybe depending on your politics. But I think it's things like that that Nolan has kind of in his sights as perhaps the most immediate threat, as well perhaps as on a philosophical level. There's a long tradition that stretches back to Rousseau as seeing civilization as bad. It's natural man that's actually good. Civilization corrupts us. I think Nolan at some level might be saying, no, civilization is good. You don't want to destroy it.
Yeah, well, I mean, sort of back as the Gnostics believing that it was bad, and so
Mhm.
we got to get out of here and forget this
Right.
earth. Let's redeem ourselves and move on to the next realm. But I guess he has to find, if he's fighting against the anarchist,
Mhm.
he's got to kind of define, okay, well then who's the bad guy? In other words, if he's making a metaphor for the big picture of our real lives when we leave the theater and walk into the real world, where we're actually engaging with citizenry and whatnot. Do you feel like he was hinting at who he saw as the bad guy? I mean, in real time, could it be the conservative? Could it be the MAGA guy? Is it
Gotcha.
that the critical legal theorists who used Frankfurt School and neo-Marxism to become the revolution is the only way to move forward, which means there is no completion, there is no finish, there is no redemption. It's constant revolution, constant destruction. Do you feel like he was trying to hint, or was he saying, you figure it out?
No, excellent question. That's actually a perfect segue into talking about the last film, because that's where I think we get something like his most direct answer to that question. And it's fascinating in part because it I don't want to say he's directly thinking about both the kind of right and left potential here, but what he's saying does bear on those kind of questions. So Dark Knight Rises answers kind of one last major political question, which is, when does society die? What is it that threatens society most? Basically, what does that look like? And it's twofold for Nolan, I think. On the one hand, The Dark Knight Rises is a really interesting film because Nolan's films are populated by lots of rich people, and as a class, no hostility to them. Like, you have your individual good guys and your individual bad guys.
Bruce Wayne's like a
right.
billionaire.
Yeah, precisely. Bruce Wayne, of course, the hero is in fact a multi-billionaire. So that's the typical Nolan. But interestingly enough, all of a sudden at the beginning of Dark Knight Rises, you have instance after instance after instance of snobby, elitist, wealthy people who are showing no interest in their fellow citizens, no interest in helping their fellow citizens, things along those lines. At some level, I think what Nolan's saying is one half of what leads society to decline is when the wealthy don't hold up their side of what good citizenry looks like, when they cease to care about their fellow citizens. Which I think, interestingly enough, I'm not claiming that Nolan is like putting Christian political theology into effect here, but I think that he is in some ways echoing a long Christian tradition that says, we're certainly not going to be communist. There's going to be private property, but at the same time, private property was conceived differently from at present in much of Christian history. Today, we tend to, in the United States at least, we tend to think it's my property means I get to do what I want with it. I get to use it at my pleasure. It's mine, my own, my precious. Whereas for most Christians through history, what it's my property has meant has been something more like, I think, this is a trust given to me by God. I'm to use it for my own good, but also for the good of those around me, for the good of my society as a whole. And so one of the concerns that has arisen at times as society has moved from a more sort of inherited aristocracy form of government to a more meritocratic, raise yourself up by your bootstraps, climb the corporate ladder sort of model, is that as people feel more responsible for their own success, they feel less concerned for those around. The old aristocracy was never perfect, obviously, but part of the ethos that defined it was this understanding that your position is there to some extent to care for those around you. And you'll see this in, again, literature. Books like Elizabeth Gaskell's North and South. It's just a brilliant investigation of this. Great British author similar to Jane Austen in some ways, where she recognizes her book North and South is kind of this investigation of the rise of the corporate factory system, the way that's a change from the landed aristocracy, and a change of ethos from I exist to look out for my subordinates to I earned my success, you should do the same. So I think half of what's going on in The Dark Knight Rises is this concern that the wealthy can sort of divorce themselves from society and say, you don't matter to me, I don't have a responsibility for you. Now that sounds kind of left wing so far, but then you get the other side of this. The interesting thing is The Dark Knight Rises comes out right about the same time as the Occupy Wall Street movement is happening in 2012 and thereabouts. And the bad guys in The Dark Knight Rises, to the extent that there's like an institutional bad guy, are basically Occupy Wall Street. They're the poor who are reacting, in fairness, in Nolan's vision, against the lack of care of the rich. But when they do so, they don't make things better. Instead, very much like the French Revolution. In fact, the movie's modeled on the French Revolution very intentionally. They destroy society. Again, interestingly enough, in pursuit of abstract justice, and it's a fairly communist vision too. As you see when Catwoman muses about how taking a home and making it everybody's home suddenly makes it nobody's home. So on the one hand, says Nolan, this again, interestingly enough, harkens back to Aristotle. You have the wealthy who think that everything revolves around them getting to do what they want. On the other hand, you have the poor reacting with bitterness and with vengeance, and the result is chaos that destroys society. I think that comes as close as Nolan ever does to explicitly saying, here's what justice looks like. It does it kind of by negative, but it looks like the poor not destroying society out of malcontent. It looks like the rich actually caring about their social duties, things like that. One of the interesting points is that Bruce Wayne himself actually is kind of considered at fault in The Dark Knight Rises. He's devastated by Rachel's death. He's withdrawn into his own private world, and in a sort of contemporary American, in the somewhat problematic sense of the term way, that might be seen as perfectly acceptable. He's not doing anything. He's just failing to do anything. He's not acting. But the film seems to say that itself is a problem, because in not acting, Bruce has failed to continue caring for example, some of the orphanages that he used to contribute to, and that's part of what leads to the malcontent that follows.
It sounded a little counterintuitive when you were saying to me about the idea of those who gain their wealth suddenly become less connected to those who, perhaps they came up with. I mean, I would think in my mind, if I was just trying to sort of break it down, those who had inherited wealth and never known anything but, especially aristocracy, they've known nothing else. They're literally told almost like they're gods, right? Because by birth, you were given this right, that they would be more disconnected, I would think, from the citizen than an entrepreneur who literally had to start from scratch. So he knew what it was to claw and struggle with others like him. And maybe some of these guys came along with him and helped him. And he's never going to forget that, because he knows the pain of trying to get there. And he's more appreciative when he arrives, as opposed to those who have never known anything else. So they take it for granted. So that was interesting to me, that analysis, because I would have thought it might have been the opposite. Well, tell me then this, as we get ready to kind of this to a close. It's been very interesting. How about the unique characters? Now, clearly it's a fantasy, right? The Batman superheroes in general are fiction, but they're representing metaphorically, the good guy, the right guy, the justice. I mean, that's kind of obvious. But what about the unique bad guys? What about the Joker, and then the Riddler now, and then Catwoman, and then Poison Ivy, and then I don't even know them all. Mr. Freeze and whatever. I don't even know how many were involved or how many they brought back. But do you think that those were just sort of fun? adventures. Let's find some interesting character that he can fight because
Right.
well, he's already beaten Joker. We need a new guy or whatever. How about this guy's the Goblin? And it's fun because it's creative. Or
Sure.
do you think that there was it? Do you think it represented a particular flaw in human nature or a specific element of evil that is being magnified through each one of these particular bad guys, antagonists?
No, absolutely. If I may, let me answer that question by kind of bringing out explicitly something that I think I've hinted at a couple times, which is how exactly does one come to these conclusions? How do you look at a film and not just say, oh, here's entertainment, but how do you think about what this film is trying to communicate to me? And I find that sometimes sometimes people will attempt to read a film and they'll end up basically saying, let me read this symbolically. Like who does this stand for? I'm not suggesting that's what you were saying, but oftentimes people have said, what does this character stand for and stuff like that. And I think that's a mistaken way to go about it, because I think the question is not what does this film represent symbolically, but rather what does this film embody? What does it show me about how the world is? Like, it's a fake representation of the world, but it is a representation of the world. And so the key questions, I think, in terms of understanding what a film is telling me, are who is the good guy and why? What is it about this character that makes this the person that we're rooting for? Who is the bad guy? Again, an exact parallel, and why? What is it about this character that means I'm supposed to hope that he or she loses? Because they're the films showing you at some level, fairly fundamentally, here's what you should want, here's what you should not want. And then just as important, kind of overarching, maybe even more important, what is it that the good character, the protagonists, learn over the course of the film? And this can also be confusing to people, because sometimes a character changes rather dramatically. You have one character that you're sympathetic with who thinks one thing at the beginning and one thing at the end. And sometimes people will object to movies on the basis of what the hero is endorsing at the beginning. But the point of the film can be that the hero learns, actually, that's a bad thing. I should think something else. So if I can totally shift to a different film and just kind of give another very brief example of this, if you think about Disney's film Frozen. The first Frozen film I deeply love. And at the same time, growing up in homeschool circles, Christian circles and whatnot, a number of different times, I've had people object to the film on the basis of Elsa's song "Let It Go," which is this song and the celebration of not caring about moral restraints, just being who you are, no matter how much damages people, stuff along those lines. And I'll hasten to say, if you've got young kids who are watching this and not able to track the story, that's a perfectly legitimate worry. But at the same time, in terms of understanding the point of the film, it's crucial that that's a mistake. The whole point of that song is that it's an attitude that Elsa is embodying at that moment that devastates her whole world, devastates everyone that she's concerned about, brings winter on her kingdom. And so the story, the arc of Frozen, the arc of the story is her learning that she has these powers that she can't hide, but she also can't just let go to do whatever they will. Instead, she has to find a way to express them that is beneficial to those around, a way to work them out that harmonizes with community life. So key ideas, I just kind of wrap that all up. Key ideas, I think, are what makes the good guy good, what makes the bad guy bad, and especially what is it that the protagonist is learning over the course of the story. I go into more depth on this in the introduction of the book, but in terms of kind of three basic questions to start out analyzing entertainment, I think those are key.
So then, should we assume then, as a Christian watching a movie, should we assume that if it's a story, I mean, a story is a story, right?
Yep.
And certainly there are some, nasty stories out there as well that have no redemption. They're very nihilistic and
or that have what they call a redemption. It's actually not. Those are very common as well. Stories that claim to have redemption or have a pseudo redemption, but it's actually not redemptive.
Okay, so that's what I was going to get at was, so should the Christian then watch program try to find the Christian worldview in it? Because one way or the other, even if it's the antithesis, this is evil because
Mhm.
they have no moral constraints. They have become completely hedonistic, that it is very pride driven, that there is no guardrails, that I have no obligations. These are all Christian ideas. So should the Christian always see the Christianity concepts in it, even if it's a darker tale? We can see this is why this leads to
Sure.
destruction.
Sure.
Or should we assume that all Christian tales are inculcated in this, whether they like it or not? Should we manufacture it so we can educate ourselves and our kids? Or should we assume it's there and all we have to do is see it when it arises and analyze it that way?
Oh, I definitely think it's a question of discerning what films are shaping me in good ways and what films are shaping me in bad ways. Because there are films that very definitely are teaching you false perspectives on reality. One of the famous Hollywood messages, if you will, that's present all over the place is essentially cast off all social bonds, don't listen to your parents, be yourself. And that's if you're showing films to your children that say that, it doesn't matter. This is something I should perhaps give a little background on, because we talked about Gnosticism earlier. Human beings, right, are not just rational spirits that think thoughts and make decisions. We are that, but we're more. We have a subconscious. We have values that we sometimes don't even fully understand ourselves, that are shaped by images that we find attractive and beautiful out there. So I'm frequently told by people that I around me that I know or that I run into, this is a horrible movie, but I know it's not real, so it doesn't matter. I'm just being entertained, or something along those lines. And at some level, right, I'm not here to be the stereotypical Puritan and say you shouldn't watch that because it's bad. Sometimes you want to blow off steam. That's totally fair. But at the same time, when one is exposing oneself to stories, one is teaching one's subconscious self, this is what I should love, this is what I should value.
So
And
you
so
think
even if
there's
you
a
say,
spiritual dimension to watching a movie, that it can affect us spiritually, that it can, because it's trying to teach us perhaps the antithesis of what is true,
yeah,
or is it a numbing of our conscience?
something of both, I think. On the one hand, okay, this is another perhaps distinction I should make. Frequently, when Christians worry about what films their children are watching, the focus is on the negative content. How much sex is in here? How many bad words are in here? Things along those lines. And I'm by no means going to say that's unimportant. It is, because oftentimes of the question of numbing the conscience.
So
A lot of G-rated movies that I would never let and a number of PG-13 or R-rated movies that I'd be perfectly happy, actually, that I will to watch. Because part of what's going on is the question of the content and how that's affecting. But part of what's going on is also, what is this teaching me about what is good and true and beautiful? And so my even bigger focus, I suppose, is that we should be watching films that teach us true lessons about what is good, what is true, what is beautiful. And we should be disciplining ourselves to some extent, at least, discerning what films are giving us bad ideas to some extent, that are shaping our vision of the beautiful in ways that we recognize as false, and not letting young kids watch them, and avoiding them ourselves to some extent as we think prudent, even as adults.
So do you think then that we should be more concerned about obviously watching the content for our children, which clearly is true, because they can't discern what's good and bad. They don't know what's going on. And our job is perhaps to watch some of these films, even if they have a little oddness in them or something that would not be, and teach them. Let's use this as a moment to say, now, why do we see the world differently than what they're doing? Do you understand? I remember watching shows with my son and about the universe or whatever, and then they'd say, the universe, over millions of years, it designed the idea of blah blah blah. It'd say something to that effect, and I would just pause it for a second. I'd say, son, what word did they use in that they don't deserve? He goes, design. I said, why? Because if it's just the universe, it doesn't have a mind, so consequently it can't design anything, because that presumes that there's a teleology to here, which obviously a material can't do. Okay, just want to make sure, click, and I just let it go. So in other words, instead of shielding them from them, I just want to make sure you know how to navigate it and understand it.
Right.
You can also talk to your friends and your others who have watched it and don't watch Harry Potter. And I say, well, why not watch it and say, here's how I see the world. I think there is magic, but here's how it works. It comes from God Almighty, and it's what we call the supernatural. In other words, we literally can have an interesting conversation. So let me end this with this, because I know a lot of people will be listening to this, especially perhaps because they do want to be careful about what their children watch. And unfortunately, Disney has gone off the rails. So, you can't just assume it's Disney, it's good. Nah, it's the opposite, frankly. They have a very specific agenda, and it ain't good. So that's sad, but it is what it is. So I'm going to say this. Well, give us, what would you say is in recent times, what you consider the most uplifting, engaging Christian worldview film? And it doesn't have to be a Christian film. I mean, a faith-based film. Some of the best faith-based films that have ever been made were not made by Christians. It's a Wonderful Life and The Blind Side. These were not made by Christians. They just told great stories that had beautiful redemptive truths to them. So what would you say is in recent times, the best Christian film with Christian insights that was the best storytelling, the most sophisticated, not the junky, oftentimes.
Sure.
And what do you think is the most dangerous film out there that has fooled people? And if you say, you know what, this is really bad, and let me tell you why. Why don't we just finish with those two ideas?
Yeah, absolutely. So best sort of like positive film and we've talked a good deal about the Dark Knight trilogy. So let me move to something that's a little bit less dark, and maybe that parents who are thinking about their children might be looking at. I think Pixar's WALL-E is one of the great films of our time, and the reason is, people often kind of watch the film once, see that there's an environmental message, and depending on their politics, think either good or bad. But I think actually that's one very small aspect of what's going on in that film. WALL-E is a film that centers around the question, what is the good life? What does it mean to be living well as a human being? And it does that in ways that are really kind of prophetic, given that it was made early 2000s, I think, roughly. But looking forward to this new world of screens and the way that that's going to affect us, the way that that's going to affect our relationships, the way that that's going to affect our health. And it's really a warning, always a warning, that left to our own devices with technology, which is power, kind of ungoverned by anyone, including ourselves, will naturally slip into entertaining ourselves 24/7. We won't exercise, and we'll eat cupcakes in a cup, sugar all day long, and so we'll become physically unhealthy. We will engage with others only through screens, and so we'll lose the social dimension that's so crucial for our lives. That's going to make it difficult for us to get married, raise families, things along those lines. And really, WALL-E is about overcoming all of those difficulties, about choosing to literally stand up out of the easy chair and take physical initiative, make yourself more physically well. It's about looking past the screen, meeting other people face to face, and forming relationships that lead to having children, things along those lines. And as part of that, it recognizes you do also need to have a good relationship with creation. Is it coming from a fully Christian perspective? I don't know. It's certainly not explicitly so, but at the same time, in as far as it goes, I think it's really a healthy film.
Well, that's interesting, because I'm going to let you finish that, but I mean, I think I kind of watched that a little bit once, and I'm guilty. I thought up it's the climate change thing. I'm out. But what you just said, talk about precedent. I mean, AI, cell phones, these kids that are not getting married, that have given up on relationship, that are believe that friendship is about being an influencer with people that you don't know and don't really care about. Wow. So if you're saying that is kind of what it was getting at, holy
Oh yeah.
smokes. That is
Oh yeah. If and again, right, think about, because the environmental message is definitely what hits you in the face, I think, oftentimes. But if you think again about the trajectory of the story, what do people need to learn? What needs to change in order for people to become healthy, to have a good life? What it comes down to is they need to be physically fit, they need to be intellectually curious, they need to be in good relationship with one another, face-to-face relationship with one another, and they need to have a healthy relationship with creation rather than simply exploiting.
wow.
So
Nice.
all of that together, I think, is quite valuable.
So what is the most dangerous one out there? And
Yeah.
specifically, if you can find one that wouldn't be so obvious. Some would be, pretty obvious if what the
Right.
rating might be or whatever. I'm talking about what would be one that one would think, oh, that's got to be okay.
Yeah.
Ooh, this is nefarious.
I'm going to make some of your listeners really angry with this one. The Princess Diaries 2. Because it's rated G, and so oftentimes people are like, it's rated G, what could possibly be wrong? And it's also at some level just this very cutesy, kids, girls movie, whatever. But also the point of the film, right, is
Say it again. I didn't hear the name.
Oh, sorry, the Princess Diaries 2.
Oh, the Princess Diaries. Okay, good.
Yeah. The point of the film, stated actually quite explicitly as, if you watch the trajectory, what's the trajectory? Princess Mia goes to this this town that she's princess of. If she's going to become queen, she has to get married, and so she tries to do an arranged marriage and just decides this isn't working. What does she learn? Ultimately, she turns at the altar to the person that she's pledged to marry and says, everyone has the right to marry for love, understood, as defined in the story earlier, as emotional fireworks. What the story is teaching you is law has no right to define who you can marry. Tradition has no right to define who you can marry, and even your own pledged word, moral constraints like that, don't have the right to define who you can marry. And so if that's the kind of the worldview that you're internalizing, that marriage is solely about how emotionally I feel toward a person, is it any surprise that we have no fault divorce in every state in the union, for example? And if you accept the movie's premise, the premise that it's ultimately inculcating, I don't see how you can object to that, for example. So again, kind of perhaps not in your face, in that it seems like it's just a friendly G-rated kids film. On the other hand, I would suggest it's an embodiment of one of the most destructive ideas of contemporary American culture. The idea that we have a right to be emotionally satisfied and to do whatever is necessary to be emotionally satisfied in our romantic life, regardless of kind of the guardrails of duty that might stand up against that.
So as we exit stage left here, we have your book, Winning the Crowd, Politics of Popular Films. And I think the addendum is film affects the values, beliefs, actions, and so forth. So, that's important. So this is somewhat of an academic, you mentioned, book. So I'm guessing it might be fairly deep and intellectually robust, perhaps.
We were striving to kind of hold a middle ground where on the one hand it is academic, it's peer reviewed, so it's holds up to that kind of question of rigor. On the other hand, I think the other authors as well, really, we're striving to produce something that could be accessible for your average person who is willing to put in some effort to understand it. So I definitely do think it's accessible to people outside.
And would you recommend it for, let's say, parents who want to be a little bit more educated on how to view Christian worldview in films?
Oh.
This might give them a primer on how to prepare themselves in the future so they can instantly see the red flags, perhaps, or the good.
Yes.
The good. Yeah,
absolutely. That is precisely part of our intended audience is lay people, especially parents who are curious about how this works and want to hone their own skills. In the introduction, I give a fairly extensive guide to how to go about this process. What are you looking for in films? What different ways does that impact you? And then also, what are some of the traps that people fall into in that process? And then each of the main chapters is doing essentially that with a film or small set of films.
Well, I appreciate you spending the time with me and also writing this book. You know, I think of all the things that have bothered me the most in the recent years in American Christianity, it's the last lack of intellectual acumen and sophistication, not teaching from the pulpit, Christian worldview, philosophy, apologetics, classic Christian uh, um, law and elements about how we see the world, because we're supposed to be informed, we're supposed to study and show ourselves approved unto God, a workman that need to be ashamed. There was a time when you were supposed to be ashamed if you didn't know how to understand how you saw the world based on your faith. It's supposed to be hard and deep, and you're supposed to study, and you're supposed to do the work and not be superficial. And that's why you get blown away with every wind of doctrine, because you don't know what you're doing. Well, get to work, and books like this will help do that. Don't fear films. Don't be one of those people that think it's all the world is all falling apart. So, you know, just know how to dissect them and help your kids navigate them so they can actually be a witness to the friends that they come into contact with. And all you adults aren't off the hook. You have a sphere of influence too, and you need to know how to address these ideas and really give people hope, because some of these films don't give you that, or at least they're obscure, and you need to be able to help direct them to the truth, which is Jesus Christ. Folks, this is Jonathan Ashbach. Get the book. We're going to have the link up here. Buy it, read it, learn how and why Christians should engage culture, especially in the performing arts and in the dissemination of information. Remember, my friends, I'm a comedian and an actor and a lot of other junk. Most of you don't know who I am. I'm used to that. But remember, if they ever say you're politically incorrect, always say thank you for the compliment. The last thing you want to be is a liar. Political correctness, of course, teaches you to censor the truth to make people feel good about themselves, and that is not a Christian. If you're a believer, you're the last truth teller on earth. And remember, I'm just doing what I do every Monday, putting the woke back to sleep. See you next time.